Pushkin.
Joe Boyd has spent more than 6 decades as a producer, label executive, and writer whose influence extends far beyond the studio. From producing Nick Drake's luminous folk albums to working with Fairport Convention, Pink Floyd, and R.E.M., Boyd has shaped some of the most enduring recordings in modern music history. But Joe Boyd isn't just a behind-the-scenes architect of sound. He's also a chronicler of the music he loves. In his 2007 memoir, White Bicycles, Making Music in the 1960s, he offered an insider's perspective on that transformative era of 1960s British music that was so well received, readers were clamoring for him to write a follow-up about the 1970s. He wrestled with that idea for a little bit and then pivoted to his voluminous new book, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, A Journey Through Global Music, published just last year. This tome takes readers across continents in search of the traditions that continue to shape contemporary sound. From Cuba to Mali, from Brazil to Bulgaria, Boyd traces the connections that bind global music together and celebrates the artists who keep these traditions alive. On today's episode, I talked to Joe Boyd about working with famed Warner Brothers CEO Mo Ostin in the 60s. He also talks about the exhaustive research he did in writing his latest book and why he decided to pinpoint 3 specific global regions as the genesis for all popular music. And Joe recalls how he came to produce the seminal 1973 documentary on Jimi Hendrix, one of my personal favorite films of all time. This is Broken Record. Real musicians, real conversations. Here's my conversation with Joe Boyd. There were a number of Americans to get out to London in the 60s, that you weren't alone in that, but it does seem you're one of the rare ones that stayed as long. You did not seem to come back. Did you ever move back to the States?
Yeah. I lived in LA for a few years in the early 70s. I was back and forth LA to London for another few years. And then I was back and forth to New York for a bit in the 90s and the noughties. But I've always, basically, except for a couple of years when I was working for Warner Brothers in LA in the early 70s, I've always had a flat in London since 1965.
I want to kind of toggle between your career, not as a writer, not as part of the book,
Right.
but also the book. So the theme of the book,
Sure.
Because you mentioned Warner Brothers, can you tell me about that Mo Ostin early 70s Warner Brothers culture and how you got involved?
One day in 1968, I guess it was early 68, on a kind of willful impulse, I called up Bill Graham and I said I wanted to come see him. And he said, okay, and gave me a time and a date. And I jumped on a plane, went to San Francisco and booked the Incredible String Band to open for the Jefferson Airplane, because I thought they shouldn't be in folk clubs. They should be opening for the Jefferson Airplane. And while I was there, I met a guy called Andy Wickham. And Andy Wickham was an Englishman who had once worked for Andrew Loog Oldham, I think. And he'd somehow migrated to California around the time of the Monterey Pop Festival. And he was now working at Warner Brothers. And we hung out and we spent some time together in San Francisco. And he said, you got to come to Burbank and meet Mo. And so I flew down to Burbank. I met Mo and we just got along great. And Joe Smith and Andy Wickham, who passed away recently, ended up being a questionable guy. He was one of those people who revealed his sort of slightly racist and slightly aristocratic and snobbish sides as he grew older. But at that time, he was the one who introduced Mo. And Mo and Joe, came from Sinatra, from Top 40 radio, from these other worlds. And Andy introduced them to the Grateful Dead. He introduced them to Joni Mitchell. He introduced them to Van Morrison. And he opened those doors for them. Somehow Mo just, the same charm that worked with Sinatra's Wise Guys worked with the Laurel Canyon guys. And Mo was just a sweet guy. He was tough. And he didn't always reveal how tough he was unless he was pushed. But his charm was such, and he had that wisdom to he surrounded himself with Lenny Waronker and Russ Titleman and, all this kind of A&R team, Van Dyke Parks. And he let them be the ones who judged the music. The record company existed in a kind of old warehouse across the street from the studio. And they kept adding people and adding offices. And so it was completely crowded. It was like you had 3 feet, and then there was the next office with a little divider, and you went to go have a pee, and you're standing next to Mo or Joe or the head of sales or the head of, and so there was so much communication. Everybody talked to everybody else all the time. And then, of course, they ended up selling 10 million Neil Young records and 10 million Joni Mitchell records, and got so much money that they said, oh, let's build a new headquarters. And I think by 77 or 76 or something like that, they built that new building down the street. And everybody was like 30 yards from each other with padded carpets, deep pile carpets in between. And the atmosphere was never the same. And the record company, I don't think, was ever the same again. I started doing some stuff. I produced a Jeff and Maria Muldaur record. I sold them a John and Beverly Martin record, neither of which sold, but for some reason they liked me. And I think there was also, it's a complicated story, but they didn't have a European operation. And so they decided the way that they would enter Europe was by buying Island Records. And I helped introduce them to Chris Blackwell. Because I was working with Chris in London. And Chris, in his inimitable, casual Caribbean way, kind of fucked them around. I mean, he just didn't take it all very seriously. And they did. And they went out on a limb to make him a very serious offer. And he never really responded. And so they got furious. And they offered Chrysalis, who was making records for Island, they offered them a label deal to move to Warner Brothers. And they went out to get revenge. This was Mo's tough side. And he went out to get revenge, to take stuff away from Blackwell, from Island. And later, they became great friends again. So this was a brief period of vengefulness. And part of that was to steal me. And so they offered me the job of music director for the film company. And I was burnt out. I had been struggling so much to keep Witch Season afloat. And we never sold enough records. And I was just getting more and more in debt. And they offered me a big salary. And Chris may have sensed the edge in this offer, but he couldn't have been nicer. He said, it's a great opportunity. You'll kick yourself if you don't take it. I'll pay off your debts and look after your artists and all that. And so go with my blessings. And so I went to California in 1971 and became the so-called director of music services for Warner Brothers Films.
And so you would sort of, in that role, the liaise between the music and the film. So Warner Brothers music would end up in Warner Brothers Films.
That was one of the jobs. I discovered that my main job, as far as most of the directors and producers were concerned, they'd call me up and say, get me John Williams. And, so it got kind of tedious. But I had some fun, Stanley Kubrick. I'd worked on Clockwork Orange. I worked on Deliverance, the banjo thing with dueling banjos. That was me. And
who played that again? Who played that banjo part?
Eric Weisberg. Because it should have been Bill Keith. Bill Keith was the guy. He was the City Billy guy who'd play with Bill Monroe. I knew him from Harvard Square. The best. And what John Boorman wanted was dueling banjos, but he wanted it slow, fast, minor key, major key, as a soundtrack, as a score. And Bill Keith would have been perfect. But Keith was on tour. He'd met a girl. He wanted to go hang out with her in Ireland. He said, "How much are you paying?" I said, $2,000. He said, "Get Weisberg." And so I got Weisberg, and Weisberg made a fortune, basically. And then, but what happened then was that I sort of maneuvered my way into producing a Jimi Hendrix documentary called Jimi Hendrix. It came out in 73. And
Great one.
when that began to be really a full-time thing, I said to Warner Brothers, I said, "Listen, let me find you a successor." And I went on to, I thought that making the Jimi Hendrix film made me a film producer, but that was delusional.
I think any Hendrix fan, that's the thing that they need to see. If there's anything that they need to see, that is the thing that they should see.
It's not available online. You can't stream it. I think there's secondhand DVDs available on Amazon, but nothing else. And I screened it during my last trip to America to promote the book and The Roots of Rhythm Remain. I did an event up the Hudson River Valley in Saugerties, and the local cinema, the night before my event, they showed the Jimi Hendrix film and got me to introduce it. And that was great.
It's amazing, by the way, how Faye, I can't remember her last name, but his girlfriend, Faye, she's like completely just like a star.
Fane Pridgeon.
Fane Pridgeon, thank you. I think she passed recently, yeah?
She passed recently, yeah. She was fantastic.
She is just so vibrant in that thing. It's unbelievable. She's almost as charismatic as Jimmy in the movie,
Yeah, yeah. And, she had, I don't know enough. I mean, somebody, it's really a shame. I don't know what's happened to it, but I heard of somebody doing interviews with her to do a kind of biography. And evidently she was, a friend or a girlfriend of like 10 of the top musicians of the 70s and 80s. She knew everybody, and everybody adored her because she never jived anybody. She told it like it was. No, I mean, there's so much in her interview. There was a moment, one of my favorite moments in the movie was her describing when she and Jimmy were living in a cold water flat, like 5th floor in Harlem, 5th floor walk up. And she gives him some money to go out and get some groceries or something. And he disappears, and he comes back, and he hadn't got any groceries. He's got an LP. And she tries to get the LP, and finally she grabs it and says, "Bob Dylan? Who the fuck is Bob Dylan?"
So good. What was the process of making that?
It was so weird because basically all during Jimmy's life, or the last few years of his life when he was famous, everybody wanted to film him. And people were constantly coming up and wanting to film him. And Mike Jeffries, who was his manager, who was a kind of thuggish guy from Newcastle, former club owner in Newcastle, he would say, "Yeah, sure. Here, you want some lights? Here's where you plug in the sound. You want an electrical extension cord. You want if all areas pass. Here, work out." And then they kept saying, "Well, we have this release form that we need you to sign." "Oh, we'll talk about that later." And then when they'd filmed Jimmy, they would come to him and try to get him to sign the release. And he said, "No, I've got my own form." And he would give them the form, which gave him 51% ownership of the film. And so nobody would sign it. And so all this footage never got released during Jimmy's lifetime. After his father appointed this wonderful guy called Leo Branton, who was an attorney, LA attorney, who represented Miles Davis, Nat Cole, Dorothy Dandridge. He was an African-American, but he was also civil rights attorney. He defended Angela Davis. And in fact, we were making the film during the trial of Angela Davis up in the Bay Area. And they had every Friday off at the trial. The trial would go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And Leo would fly back from Oakland to Burbank and would come straight to Warner Brothers to see what we had done in the previous 7 days with the film. And we'd show him a new scene or whatever. And he wasn't that interested in Jimmy's music. He was a Miles Davis guy. And he would then do his imitation of the judge, the prosecutor, Angela Davis, in the trial. And we spent the whole time just sitting there listening to him tell us the inside story of the trial. And I went to Thanksgiving dinner at his house and sat next to Angela Davis. And that was what was going on sort of in the background, because what happened was that when he got the job to represent the estate, he discovered there was all this footage that had never been seen. And Jeffries was now powerless because he'd represented Jimmy, who was deceased. Now it was a family. The heirs could appoint whoever they wanted. They appointed Leo. And he came to see Mo because Jimmy was signed to Warner Reprise at the time in America. And then Mo took him, walked him across the street to see me and Ted Ashley, who was the head of the film company. And out of that meeting came the idea originally just of, Joe, why don't you have a look at all this footage and see what you think of it and see if you think there's a film there.
That's what he's asking you.
Yeah. So he asked me, that was my job. I was the liaison between the two sides of the street. And so I said, yeah, and we could film interviews with this and this and this, and we could put this together. And they go, okay, you do it, Joe. So
Did Mo have much of a relationship with Hendrix? I mean, I know they met backstage at Monterey, I believe, right?
I don't think there was much. Jimmy, his relationship, I think Mike Jeffries worked very hard to keep Jimmy away from Mo. He wanted everything to go through him. And also initially, the deal was through Track Records in England. Mm-hmm. And so it was like he'd signed to Track for the world, and then Track licensed it to, and then at a certain point they paid some money to get Track out of the middle.
Yeah. And The Roots of Rhythm Remain is, it's an astounding book. I have to imagine this idea came to you many decades ago.
I always liked to write. I mean, I always wrote the press releases for Hannibal Records, and I wrote some articles, and then I started doing some book reviews in the early 2000s, and I just thought, yeah, I'll write a book. I started writing a biography, and I thought, like when I was born, and I said, please stop. No, that's not right. It can't be about me. It's got to be about the 60s. And so I wrote White Bicycles, focused on this decade because I felt I had something to say about the decade. And, I've been around for a lot of important moments in the decade, and I enjoyed doing it a lot. And then, I started going out and doing interviews and book readings and stuff. And people would come up to me and say, so when are you going to do the book about the 70s? And I said, you must be joking. 70s was not fun for me. I didn't have a good 70s. I don't have anything interesting to say about it. But I liked writing White Bicycles, and I liked the fact that I was no longer was I looking after the career of musicians who rarely did what I wanted them to. But I was looking after somebody who did everything I wanted him to, me, and I thought, yeah, I'll write another book. That's what I'll do. I'll write another book. And very quickly it came to me what I would do. I guess there were a couple of kernels of ideas that had been festering in my brain a little bit. And I would say there's three that really pushed me off the edge of that ski jump so that I had no choice but to keep going. One was what I put in the preface to the book, which is the realization of how different Cuban and American rhythmic sensibilities are, and try to get to the bottom of that. Because I knew enough to know that it had something to do with history and with slavery, but it was worth digging into. And I had also read Ned Sublet's book by that time, Cuba and Its Music, which is a great book. And it really it kind of opened my eyes to the depth of what you could discover when you dug into a musical culture like Cuba. And then also at the time, way back in the late 80s when Graceland was so popular, everybody thought there was a controversy about Paul Simon, not respecting the boycott. And I know a lot about South Africa. I've been there a couple of times. I hadn't spent a lot of time there, but I'd worked with a lot of South African musicians. I produced a play, a kind of anti-apartheid musical. And so I knew a lot about South Africa. I'd read a lot about South Africa. And I knew that what people thought was the controversy wasn't really the controversy. And I saw all these Paul Simon fans buying Ladysmith Black Mambazo records and buying Mahlatini and the Mahlatella Queens records, which was great. I mean, because it's great music. Those records are very much worth buying. But everybody felt virtuous about buying them, and that they were somehow supporting Mandela by buying them. And I knew that they were Zulus, and the Zulus were kind of the enemy of Mandela, that supporting Zulu culture was not the same as supporting the ANC. In fact, it was quite different and even opposed. And I thought, well, that's something that people don't know that I could tell them. And then I also thought about my time working in Bulgaria, and I loved those choir records, the Mystère de Voix Bulgare and the Kutev Ensemble, and I was always a bit head scratching, that those Bulgarian national ensembles were so great, and the rest of the Eastern European state ensembles were kitsch and kind of weird and boring and like acrobatic, and what's that all about? And then I talked to Philip Kutev's daughter, who told me how much the Russians hated her father and why they hated him, because he used the authentic peasant voice in the choir, and how Stalin was trying to get completely obliterate peasant culture. And I thought, well, that's interesting too. So these three ideas, the Cuban rhythms, South African Zulu versus ANC, and Russians hating Bulgarian choirs, there's stories in here that I would have fun telling people. And I figured if these stories exist in Eastern Europe and Cuba and South Africa, they probably exist. And I knew enough about other cultures to know that there was probably some more fun stuff to dig up there. And so I just got started, and that took me 17 years. I didn't realize it was going to take that long.
We'll be back with more from Joe Boyd after the break. And the history of the 19th and 20th century kind of does seem to be, region to region, this sort of repression and this sort of cultural movement bubbling up from people to counter state repression with art. And your book really wonderfully tells that story. I wasn't expecting that to be narratively done so well in your book. But then there's also the way in which these cultures then shared, all of the music moved around the globe and then back again. And so music from Africa would go to the Caribbean and then back to Africa and then come to the States and then back. And there's this cultural exchange happening amongst cultures and countries and various forms of music that we don't often think about.
Yeah, everything. I mean, the takeaway, one of the takeaways I hope people would get from the book is there is no pure culture. There is no pure musical culture for sure. It's all mixed.
Yeah.
It's all a blend. As you said, it bubbles up from underneath. And underneath, in a way, are two groups, Africans and Roma.
Mm.
I just sort of realized, and I realized almost more after I finished the book, and I've been touring and talking about it and doing Q&As and things like that. One of the things I realized is, and I mentioned in the book, but maybe I might have, if I went back and rewrote the book, I might make more of a theme of it, is the fact that going way back, certainly to the beginning of the 19th century, what defines modernity is how African it is or how Roma it is. You know, by the late 19th century, Cakewalk, the Grizzly Bear, you know, the Charleston, all that became the dominant force of for young people to dance to. And if you weren't dancing to that sort of rhythm, you were square.
Mm.
And if you go back a little further to Goethe and the Romantics, who was the big musical revolutionary? Liszt. You know, he was this matinee idol who toured across Europe with fainting females, and he modeled his whole performance style on a Roma musician that he saw that was famous in Hungary when he was a kid. And this flamboyance, this joy, this kind of taking the notes written on the page and decorating them and playing them with trills and playing them with accents and playing them in a crazy new way. That's Roma.
Mm.
It defined what was new and what was shiny and what was attractive to young people. You know, that's one of the problems that European folk music has had, you know, in the last 50 years, has been that it lacks any kind of African feeling rhythmically, and therefore is consigned to being square.
You brought up English folk music, and there's an example from your discography that kind of illustrates the way in which a group of people sometimes learn about themselves best from outsiders, you know, and how outsiders can sort of reaffirm your sense of who you are. And there's sort of this example from the Fairport Convention.
Yeah.
Fairport Convention, it's not until 1969, and they discover a song, A Sailor's Life, that they really embrace English folk music. Prior to this, they sort of are working more from an American tradition. And maybe you can talk a bit about that, because I think it's
When I first heard Fairport, I was very impressed with their musicianship. The upside was how good they were, and particularly Richard Thompson, on their instruments. The downside was they kept singing, you know, Richard Farina and Eric Anderson and Phil Oakes, and to be fair, some very good Bob Dylan songs. But I thought, why are these English kids so wrapped in this music that I kind of left America to get away from? No, I mean, I just was never that sold on the white middle-class singer-songwriter idea. And so then they added Sandy Denny to the group, and Sandy had been around the folk clubs for a few years, and she had never been a songwriter before. She had been a balladeer. She sang traditional Scottish, Irish, English ballads. And she would play these ballads to them in the van when they would go to gigs. And little by little, it kind of got through to them. And so then they did that track you mentioned, Sailor's Life. But they just still thought of it as one string to their bow, you know, one thing that they did along with other things. Richard and Sandy were writing songs. That was a new aspect, new dimension of their music. And then they had this terrible crash, and the drummer Martin Lamble was killed, and a girl, Jeannie the tailor, was killed as well. And they were devastated, and they thought they would break up. They would never play again. And then when they decided to reform, they They wanted to do something completely new. So they would never play the songs that they played with Martin on drums with a new drummer. That was the idea. And right at that time, out came Music from Big Pink. And everybody, all musicians in London were just gobsmacked, as the English say, by Music from Big Pink. And again, there's a little outsider element there because they're Canadians, but still, what they were doing was a fresh approach to a very American form of music.
Yeah.
And building something unbelievably original, appealing, virtuosic, all this, with that record. And in a way, they were following on from Bob Dylan at Newport in 1965 more than Bob Dylan was.
Yeah.
And doing something really rich and interesting. And so in a way, it hit the Fairport like a rebuke.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you English boys from Muswell Hill, you think you can play some American stuff? Is that how you want to reinvent yourself after the crash? Forget about it. This is defining that moment. And so they really went to try and do with British traditional music what the band was doing with American traditional music. And they were so lucky because they were clever. They found a drummer in Dave Mattox who was not a rock drummer. He was a jazz drummer. He was a dance band drummer. And he found the dance rhythms in all the songs that they wanted to play. The record just comes alive, because of that mix, and adding Dave Swarbrick, who was a very wonderful traditional fiddle player, into the band, made this record that changed everything in Britain, in the folk scene anyway. Legion Leaf.
Yeah.
It really had a huge impact.
And he brings in the rhythms that, to your point, where English folk music could be seen as square, he sort of starts to bring in some rhythms that maybe help.
Yeah, he does it with jazz chops.
Yeah.
At that time, I don't think Legion Leaf was at the top of the list of the hippest records on the charts, but it was a lot hipper than any other folk record at that time. And it captured the imagination of a certain portion of the audience.
It's just fascinating to me that this group that we think of as a consummate English folk group starts because they're sort of doing American folk music, in the process rediscover the English folk tradition. Canadian group does Americana better than any American possibly could, and then forces Fairport Convention to confront who they, their own roots and who they are as people.
And this process repeats and repeats. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that back and forth with Fela and James Brown.
Yeah.
That somebody said about when James Brown's extended jams, extended dance tracks began making inroads. There's a woman writer who I quote in the book saying, those records told us that we were really from somewhere else, that Africa was really over there, that there was something different about African-American culture. And then Fela, who had been watching as James Brown imitators spread all across West Africa, people imitating James Brown very slavishly, trying to sound exactly like James Brown. And then he came to LA, and somehow that exposure to Black Panthers, to the music, to the culture, he went back to Nigeria and created something that was a bit James Brownish, but very Nigerian.
Yeah.
And so that back and forth happens, not just between the band and Fairport Convention. And by the way, there was a lovely footnote to the Fairport Convention story that many years later, an English singer who I know was playing at a festival, and he met the guys from Los Lobos, and they said, "Oh, do you know Richard Thompson and the Fairport Convention?" And he said, "Yeah, I know those guys. They're friends of mine." He said, "Well, when you see them, tell them that if it hadn't been for Legion Leaf, we would have still been a heavy metal band from East LA.
Whoa.
That it was Legion Leaf which convinced Los Lobos to dig into their own cultural background."
You would never listen to Los Lobos and hear Legion Leaf. That is,
But it's just a conceptual thing. It's like that, maybe that's what we should do instead of trying to sound like, Def Leppard
that
or
is
something.
amazing.
Yeah.
There's an additional wrinkle, really, in a way, to the James Brown Fela interplay. And if you think about it, slave trade initiates from Africa. In Cuba, you get these African rhythms that start to form and influence, the music of Cuba. You get things like the habanera you talk about, which is a Cuban rhythm, a Havana rhythm, right? It comes to America, likely, I'd imagine, through New Orleans, probably.
Yeah.
And you get these rhythms that start to influence early R&B music, which would then, of course, influence James Brown, which would then influence Fela. Fela's also taking in Cuban music, happened to be a big fan of Cuban music, was taking in those records directly as well, comes to America, picks up the James Brown, goes back, and you so you start to get this really bizarre Africa influence in Cuba going back to Africa through this James Brown connection and Fela. And it just becomes like, whoa, like there really are no boundaries. There's no borders.
Yeah. The whole extended jams of those James Brown records from the late 60s, early 70s were inspired by the montuno. The scratch guitar parts most of them are clave. 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3. So you have the influence of Latin, Afro-Cuban music into America, into Africa, meeting in the middle of the Atlantic, and you're never going to get a simple diagram.
No.
A linear explanation of anything to do with music or culture. It's so whirls around in the wind, it's.
Yeah. Were there histories of any countries or cultures you considered including, but ultimately didn't get to?
Not really, because basically the idea from the beginning was the music we all know, but we don't know about it. So I love Rumbetico, I love Fado, I love Northern African music, Algerian, Moroccan, Egyptian. That would have made it a different book.
Okay.
Everything that's in this book is something to say, oh yeah, I've got a couple of Ravi Shankar records.
Yeah.
I'll read that. Or I took those Latin dance lessons when I was in college. And, everything in there is hopefully got some tangential relationship to people's listening experience with music.
How has digital distribution in the modern age aided and or disrupted this global flow of music that you illustrate in the book?
Well, in some levels, of course, it aided it. My wife and I put together 2 playlists of 100 tracks each on Spotify and Apple, that we can send out. I'm preparing a newsletter that'll send this out to everybody. And that's great, and in my research, I was able to dig things out on YouTube and Spotify and hear things that I never would have been able to hear, and to write about it in a way that probably I couldn't have in some cases. And I think that a lot of the changes that pulled music away from the sort of thing that I like listening to didn't happen because of digital distribution. I think, the traditional record companies that made so many great records and pressed so much great vinyl, and that whole ecosystem of vinyl records and jukeboxes, and, that was destroyed by the cassette, first and foremost. So on the one hand, technology gives with one hand, takes away with the other. And the same thing has happened with CDs and the death of vinyl, the rebirth of vinyl. The biggest change has been the rhythm machines, in terms of the music that I write about in this book. I write about music that's made by people in a room, in a moment, playing off each other, rhythms that have been learned from elders to youngers, that have been absorbed through culture. And now, rhythms fly around the world very fast, and you can sit in Tokyo and hire somebody to give you a rhythm track in Marseille, send it to you digitally, and you can relay a Japanese rap track over it. It's just a different thing. It's a whole different thing. And people say, how far up to the present did you write the book? I said, really, I wrote from antiquity up to the drum machine, because that's where everything changes and it becomes a different subject, and not one that I could really address and keep the book under 900 pages.
There was another question I had. What do you make of hip hop and sampling?
When I hear, even with like a singer-songwriter, and from the first bar, I know that there's a click track going on here. It's not that you can even hear the percussion. It's just you can hear the regularity. You can hear the absolute inflexible regularity of the rhythm. And sometimes I'll hear very nice singing and a very nice words, but I don't feel I have to listen to it again. To me, I don't know, this is just my crackpot theory. If music was made in a moment where nobody knew what was going to happen next, from beat to beat, minute to minute, that sense of danger, that sense of adventure, you're not just laying it down with your heads in earphones, with a click track somebody sent you, and you're adding a bass part to something that already has a keyboard. If you're doing it live in a room with musicians and nobody knows how it's going to turn out, is it going to be a good take or a bad take? It's a collective adventure.
Yeah.
That feeling passed through the technical process to the final product, whether it's a streaming file or a CD or a cassette or a vinyl or whatever it is. When the listener gets some of that sense of adventure, it translates. It feels more adventurous to listen to, for me anyway.
One last break, and we'll come back with Joe Boyd. There was and Prince famously used the Linn drum in various rhythm machines and drum machines. But he I forget which rap hip hop producer was now, like, well, I won't say a name because I don't remember who it was, but a very famous hip hop producer at some point had a conversation with Prince, and Prince said, you know what, you're making these like, I know I use drum machines, but like, you guys are only producing on the computer. At least with the drum machine, I would connect it to speaker. I was moving air still with my drum machine. I was moving air with it, and then adding other things on top of it. You are only creating in a computer, and this isn't music. There's no air being moved at all. That is a great example of why Prince was really great with the drum machine, and it sort of
No, I mean, he's an exception that kind of proves the rule or whatever, because he did. But I have to say, I went to see Prince one of the early times he came to London. It wasn't in an arena. It was in like a 3,000 seat hall, and I had a pretty good box seat overlooking the stage, and I was kind of excited to see him. But there were light effects, and there was things going on. Everybody had a little earbud, and so you knew that somewhere underneath the stage there was a hard drive with something cueing, like a pulse, and it got a little boring, a little tiring after a while. And then there was this moment where you could tell that it switched off. And Prince just got out his guitar and he started playing Purple Rain, I think, or something. And he was completely free of the click. And it was just transcendent. It was just brilliant. It was just fantastic. Years later, I went to see him at the O2, and I got so there's some weird connection. My second cousin was playing keyboards in the opening act. And so I got to go backstage. And then we went to the after party, the after show, which was in a small theater behind the O2. And some of the people in the backing, in the opening band, and some of Prince's guys, they all were out on stage, like hooking up their instruments. And Prince walked out on stage, and he went up to the microphone, and he looked around at the band. He looked around, and he said, "Let's do Stevie." And so they did an hour-long set of Stevie Wonder covers. Just no click, nothing rehearsed, just these guys, this great band, and Prince playing Superstition and, all this stuff. And then they take a break. And they say, "We'll be back." And they come back like 15 minutes later. And again, everybody goes to their instruments. They're all sitting there waiting, what's Prince going to do? And he goes up to the microphone. He says, "Sly." And they did an hour of Sly covers. And it was just fantastic,
Yeah.
And I have to say, I loved it more than the show, which was good.
Oh, then the O2 show.
The O2 show.
Yeah.
And I had a good seat and everything, but it was, you could feel it was very programmed. Everybody knew exactly when the cues were, and the lights did this, and and even though the drummer was playing, but everybody had had earbuds.
Yeah.
And, it was okay. It was a good show, but that after party was never to be forgotten.
In hindsight, who knew the unfocused, the drummer you could never get to pay attention or focus would be our greatest asset all these years. That it's like, the drummer speeding up or changing to a new part. It's like that really,
But sometimes, yes, of course, there are times when you, as a producer, you tear your hair out because the drummer can't keep time. But other times, it just picks up, the intensity sort of picks up in a nanosecond. Yeah. Just because something has happened, somebody's done something on an instrument, everything just gets that little more intense, and everything just picks up a little bit. And also, I mean, and there's some, Al Jackson and some of those, you can't define it. It's just, he lays back. He plays at the last moment the last nanosecond that can still be considered the beat.
Yeah.
And it's got a sensuality to it that a lot of modern records just are different. It's not the same thing.
And it's also the way that he's playing behind the beat in relation to Duck Dunn or
exactly.
Dunn playing bass it's all, or if you listen to Oye Como Va, the Tito Puente, or the Carlos, it's the way the piano player's unique sense of rhythm against the bass player's unique sense against Tito's it's just all working against each other.
If anyone ever says, "Well, I don't know, I don't think you're right. Everybody should play in time," I would say Exhibit A would be Try a Little Tenderness. The way it begins, was just I think it's just a guitar and then just a piano comes in, and it's very tentative rhythmically. And everybody's just listening to Otis singing, and then it grows, and then it speeds up, and it gets more into, it's like the difference between the feel at the end of that track and the feel at the beginning is a journey,
Yeah.
an unbelievable journey.
Mhm.
And it's, you could just feel the room, these guys just looking at each other. Yeah, should I do this now? Okay, okay, I'll try that. Okay, oh wow, Otis just did something, and let's answer that. And and it's just so intense, that track.
I feel like reading the book, thinking about that. I've always loved, we talked about it a bit, just the way cultures interact, interplay. The great boogeyman around this conversation these days is the word cultural appropriation. On one hand, I understand the critique. On another hand, I hate that just the existence of the word could put an end to anyone thinking about borrowing this from that culture, or this thing from that culture, and then putting it together into their own thing and making it something completely unique.
In the events that I do, Andrea is usually with me, and she's running the Spotify streamer when we want to have illustrations. And I say, okay, let's go to the heart of cultural appropriation. Here is the moment of cultural appropriation. And we play The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And then we play Wimoway. And, Pete Seeger is a heroic figure who always was for the underdog, and he was, for fairness. And but he was in an era when anything that you didn't have a composer credit was considered public domain, or, whatever. So he's getting money from Wimoway. He's getting a bit of the money from The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And then I play Mbube, which is the original. And it's fascinating to feel the audience, because they know Lion Sleeps Tonight by the tokens. Everybody knows that. They know Pete Seeger singing Wimoway. That's familiar, or at least it's not surprising. Then they hear Mbube. It's so intense and so profound and so rich and so individual, like this guy, Solomon Linda, who improvises the hook that has made millions and millions and millions of dollars for Disney. Now the fact that no money reached Solomon Linda is cultural appropriation. That is cultural appropriation. There's a series now, a film on Netflix called The Lion's Share, about the royalties of The Lion Sleeps Tonight. It's fascinating. It's depressing. It's shocking. But, you understand, in a way, it was a time before anybody had lawyers and thought about all these kinds of things. But, cultures all over the world, African cultures, African American cultures, use the Hawaiian guitar, slide steel guitar. It was invented by Joseph Kikuku on Oahu Island in 1887. Nobody's ever paid him anything.
Yeah.
I mean, and to try and draw a border and say, now, okay, whatever went before is one thing, but now we're going to put up a fence.
Yeah.
You can't actually listen to this stuff and use that influence in your music, because that's appropriation. I think it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because nothing is pure. There is no pure culture. And the story of the Roma is a perfect example. I mean, they went from South Asia all the way across the Middle East, up into the Balkans, up into Europe. They changed European music totally. And popular music all over the world wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the African influence through Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Mississippi, Chicago, whatever. And it always mixed. The root of it all started with African slaves being forced to play for dances where the French did contredanse and quadrilles. And, it wasn't just African music they were playing French music, but they were playing it mixed in with their own culture. And it's always been a mix. All music is a mix. So how you actually begin to parse out where the line can be drawn, I don't know. It's beyond me.
We didn't talk about this, but you spent a lot of time with some early blues greats, Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and on and on and on. You also got to spend a lot of time in England. Where do you, in this particular era, where do you land on Led Zeppelin?
I mean, I was never a big Led Zeppelin fan, but not because I objected to what they did with, any more than I object to Eric Clapton. I mean, who I object to because of some of his public positions. But I don't have a problem with Eric Clapton playing Crossroads.
Yeah.
And, eventually, when the legal world woke up to the values of copyrights and all these things, Robert Johnson's sister, I think, made, his family, long after he died, of course, got a pretty decent payday, a pretty good share of all those box sets that CBS issued of Robert Johnson. And even, I think, some covers, by rock bands. And I know for a fact that Muddy Waters and Rosetta and people loved the fact that they found a white audience.
Yeah.
And the fact that they found people who ate up their music and loved their music. And and part of that would be the simple fact of buying a ticket to go see Rosetta. But, Chuck Berry stole from Rosetta.
Yeah, that's a good call.
Chuck Berry is pure Rosetta.
Yeah.
And then everybody else stole from Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
And so you can't, where do you draw the line? Should Chuck not have stolen from Rosetta?
Yeah. Last question, then I'll let you go. You talked about how the way music from Big Pink really changed everything. There were a lot of groups that then changed their style of music. Pete Townsend has said when he heard that, it definitely inspired him to write in a particular way, other people as well. But, 6 months earlier or so, it's a different record, but it's a return to Americana in a sense, in the middle of psychedelia and all this stuff. Bob Dylan released John Wesley Harding. Why did that not disrupt the sort of psychedelic thing and sort of reorient people the way music from Big Pink would 6 months later?
I mean, I love that record. I think it's a very good record, but it's not in the top 5 Dylan records of all time. So it didn't have the same impact of Blonde on Blonde, for example.
Right.
And also, as Dylan himself acknowledged, I think in some interview or something, I think Jimi Hendrix had something to do with the failure of John Wesley Harding record to have that impact, because Jimmy's cover of All Along the Watchtower blew it out of the water. I mean, Dylan acknowledged that. He said, I can't listen to my own recording of All Along the Watchtower because I'd rather listen to Jimmy's.
Yeah.
And Jimmy's take on that just, was so immense and so extraordinary. And I think, you can't go back to a culture can't go back to the well that often. Dylan had huge impact, like 3-4 times in a short space of time, like whiplash. The whole Western culture suffered whiplash from Dylan. Like, wait a minute, he's done this? Oh, now he's doing this. Oh my God. And I think, at a certain point, particularly because it's sort of a subdued record, and that and Nashville Skyline and Self-Portrait are kind of curiosities, and I like them all. I mean, but particularly John Wesley Harding. It doesn't surprise me that they weren't course change. They didn't spin the steering mechanism of the ship.
Makes sense. Man, there's so much more I want to ask another time. Great speaking to you.
Okay, all the best.
In that episode description, you'll find a link to a 7-hour playlist Joe Boyd created to accompany his new book, In the Roots of Rhythm Remain, A Journey Through Global Music. Be sure to check out youtube.com/Broken Record Podcast to see all of our video interviews. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Broken Record Pod. You can follow us on Twitter at Broken Record. Broken Record is produced and edited by Leah Rhodes with marketing help from Eric Sandler and Jordan McMillan. Our engineer is Ben Tolliday. Broken Record is a production of Pushkin Industries. And if you like this show, please remember to share, rate, and review us on your podcast app. Our theme music's by Kenny Beats. I'm Justin Richmond.